Along here, this is a second in our series of looking at the history of our region and really kind of reflecting on it. And today, because it's the 20 years since AMTA United, we're going to interview a couple of people that were definitely big parts of that and talk a little bit about AAMT and any questions that you have we want to incorporate too. So this is your chance to like interact with these icons, or what would you call you? I saw you went with that. You had like a helmet on once, right? With what is the story of that? By the way?
That's just plain silliness. That's all.
Okay, there was a Viking helmet. I saw him in a Viking helmet, which is it's on YouTube and everything. So it's good. So anyway, today Ken Egan was going to be a part of this, but he's not able to be Skyping with us today. So we have another person who is instrumental in this, and that's Gary Hara, who's joining us from work in New York City. He's Associate Director of Therapeutic Activities Services, and there's a lot more stuff that he's had to put after his name. But I just want to read actually that you were an AAMT president, and as president-elect when you were really talking about this, getting the conversation going about uniting. And you were the president in 94 to 96.
Right.
Gary. And Ken was the president. You were president-elect when you were really kind of discussing it, and we had a meeting about it. And so today we're just going to talk about what occurred before, what kind of led up to this unification, this idea. And Bryan here, Bryan Hunter, is currently Nazareth chair of the Creative Arts Therapy Department and professor. And you were NAMT president at that time. What years was that?
94, 95.
94, 95. And he's been definitely very involved otherwise too. So we are videotaping this, and we're going to be posting this on YouTube, or for everyone to take a look at, because I really like hearing this history and remembering the past. That's what this is about. So again, bring questions to them. Maybe we could just start off with introducing yourselves and talk about a little bit about the AMT and AAMT. Gary, go ahead.
Good on. Hello, everybody. This is funny. Calling from work. It looks like I'm doing my own selfie on the phone. Basically, just to go with my background, I started in music therapy in 1980 at NYU, which was a relatively new program, and the AAMT was pretty young. So the story I got from back then, this is the story I got as a new student, is that we have the AAMT because there was even though there is another organization out there that in the split, because NYU wanted to have its own program, music therapy program, that would be more flexible in the standards, and more importantly, to have more direct contact with the internship sites and internship supervisors. They felt like the NAMT at the time could not accommodate that type of relationship. That's I feel like at the time, so they kind of split off. And the person behind it was Jerry Ross at the time. He was I think actually might have been the dean there at the time at NYU, and he decided to basically form his own organization. So that's how in the background of AAMT, the American Association, got started in some ways. And as a new student, I never quite understood why they had to split off like that. It was a great inconvenience. I know when I was starting off, why they had two separate things. The field was not recognized itself anyhow by the general public, and certainly not by the healthcare administrators. But to have two separate organizations seems to be a real pain, to say the least. But it's funny, after I graduated, I ended up working in Connecticut, living in Connecticut, actually at an MAT internship site. So I got to know a lot of my colleagues, the RMT colleagues, and the training standards of the MAT, the pros and cons of it. And then also in my years in Connecticut, I got involved with the eventually with the CBMT. I was on their continuing ed committee and grown to know about that organization and the standards. And then also I was involved a lot in New York State with the NICAD at the time. That's the New York Creative Arts Therapy Coalition, where we were working towards trying to get licensure for the state and within the state. And what that involves is political action in that arena. So, but it's viewing up, then moving forward to the 1990s, where I get more involved with the board of directors at AAMT. The relationship between two organizations was strained at the beginning, but I think it became more relaxed as we had more contact together. Certainly we had more meetings together, more invite, get to know each other's people. That certainly helped. And I think one of the key things of leading up to unification was certainly I remember Norm Goldberg, who's the president of the music company NMT, that he tried to initiate a meeting together after we had a successful joint conference together, the organization in Toronto. So it was that's where the agreement got hashed out and all that. But that's I guess I leave that. Let me stop at this point. I don't want to get too far because I know Bryan would probably have more to say on this area.
Is that the meeting you were talking about, Bryan, the 1991 meeting or something?
Well, the meeting that was the where we articulated a proposal was actually May of 1994 in Philadelphia. That happened subsequent to discussions between Ken Egan and Norm Goldberg and myself and Norm Goldberg. Norm, founding president of MMB Music, founding member of the American Orchestra Work Association, who had encouraged us to revisit the issue of putting the two associations back together. Something that had been discussed on more than one occasion, but he was the one who sort of prompted that discussion that began in 1994, subsequent to the Toronto conference that Gary mentioned, which was, how many of you were at the conference in Toronto in 1993? Okay, that was an extraordinary conference that was successful on every measure, and I think the memberships of both NAMT and AAMT began to look at, wow, look at what music looks like when we're together. And so Ken and I had a chance to meet and talk informally before the meeting in May, because we were both at the Canadian meeting in Vancouver earlier in the month, and it was there that we began to talk about some things, and Ken proposed the question to me, which he had actually written to me in a letter earlier, but I never received the letter. So when he asked me this question, it was pretty stunning. He said, as we were sitting at the top of a Sheraton hotel in Vancouver that had a revolving restaurant, which was stunning because you had the ocean, you had the mountains, and you had the city, and it all sort of just kept changing. It was amazing.
Who wouldn't unify with
Who
that?
wouldn't, right.
Perspective.
And Ken said, well, can we talk a bit about what we're going to talk about in Philadelphia in a couple weeks? And I said, sure. And he said, well, what would you think about the idea of AAMT becoming a region of NAMT? And I often said that it was a good thing I was sitting down at the time that he said that, because I probably would have fallen down had I not been sitting. And so I said, well, that's certainly a place to start the discussion. I said I really had perhaps something more in mind along the line of a merger of the two rather than one sort of engulfing the other. But that was the place to start the discussion. And then we met later in Philadelphia. 6 people met in Philadelphia. Gary is president-elect. Barb Royer is president-elect of AAMT. Gary is president-elect of AAMT, Barb NAMT, myself, Ken, and then representing the music products industry advisors to the board. Norm had been asked to be an advisor to the AAMT board for some time for the music industry, and I had appointed for the first time in NAMT's history an advisor for the music industry, and that was Carl Brune. And the two of them were also there. So there were 6 of us, and we met for a full day in Philadelphia, and we formulated the basic tenets of the proposal after we had talked through what we thought the main issues were, which included education and clinical training, the issue related to credentialing, publications, those sort of very big topics. And we talked through how we might deal with those, and then put pen to the paper, as it were, and fleshed out into a proposal that we all signed off on, and then subsequently sent it to the memberships. We were on a bit of a timeline crunch because the AAMT conference, this was May, the AAMT conference was in June. It was Ken's last conference as president, and he wanted to be able to talk to the board, his board, and to the members. So we had to release it to everybody at once. You couldn't do it piecemeal, and it was sent as a proposal that was for discussion purposes. We made it clear that there was not going to be any action on this, but it was for discussion purposes, and we sent it out. And I have said on more than one occasion, I put that proposal into the mail, and this is the days before, of course, cell phone, texting, computers, et cetera, and I put the proposal in the mail and then sat and waited for what I thought would be my phone to begin to ring off the hook, and it never did. It never rang. So we started the process of discussion and town hall meetings, and Gary or Ken, either Gary or Ken and I and Jim Borling, who was chair of CBMT, went to all 8 regions. We were at the AAMT conference again the following year. We went to all 8 regions in the spring of '95 to do town hall meetings. People asked questions, expressed concerns, expressed support, but all 3 of us were there to be a part of that discussion. CBMT was important in that discussion because a part of dealing with the issue of both reciprocity of credential between NAMT and AAMT, as well as the bizarre status of credentialing at that point. Anybody know off the top of their head how many ways there were to designate a music therapist in 1994?
RMT, CMT.
ACMT.
Keep going.
MTBC.
Keep going.
TBC.
You could add
Oh,
R to the front of the MTBC and those permutations. So there were a total of 7 ways to designate a music therapist in 1994. That's really a great branding strategy, right? For a very small profession. So we had to deal with that, and so CBMT was important in that process because a part of the agreement was to give up the association credentialing and turn it over to CBMT. So Jim was a part of the discussion. So we did the road show in 1995 to all of the town halls. And the conference planners were just amazing. They were really gracious because, as you know, lots of regions take place many times on the same weekend, right? And so one weekend we were in I think 4 cities in 3 days or 4 days. I was on an airplane 5 times in one day. That was an all-time record.
Whirlwind tour.
The Western region interrupted their cabaret around 11 o'clock to have the town hall meeting in the midst of it. That's the kind of response we had. People were really ready to talk about this, and they made the accommodation to do that. But that's how we got them all started, and the process by which it was discussed, and a bit of revision happened along the way to the original proposal. We originally were proposing the name, for instance, the name United States Association for Music Therapy. That was never popular, and we ended up, with the American Music Therapy Association, a much better name.
What was the first one, Brian? Sorry, I missed.
The name that was in the original proposal was United States Association for Music Therapy, or USAMT. Never popular, and we didn't do initially the American Music Therapy Association because we thought that might be too similar to AAMT. But anyway, that ended up not being such a big deal to change to, which is one of the things I thought would be a big deal for NAMT was the name change, and it was for some people, but it was never the deal I thought it might be at the end of the day, interestingly enough. At the NAMT conference in Houston, the Assembly finished its debate on the proposal. and I was standing at the back of the room holding my breath until Linda Wright Bauer finally called the vote on it, and they passed it. And I pretty much thought, with regard to NAMT, that if the Assembly passed it overwhelmingly, the membership would follow suit in terms of the vote, and they did. It was over 80% vote in the NAMT membership and about a 90% vote in the AAMT membership. They passed it, so.
Those are paper ballots then.
Those are paper ballots.
I counted it.
Look at that, there was a tough.
I was on the local committee
Yeah.
since I lived in suburban DC
Yeah.
to count
So
those votes.
that's a real quick and quick sort of summary, but we only have a short time, so we need to stop talking and see what kinds of questions you might want to ask or talk about.
Great idea. Anyone have some questions for
Well,
Ken?
Just to add, I was the school support services chair for AAMT at the time, and so I went to some of the regional meetings of the other student organizations, and we would like, we were like, yeah, why are we separated in the first place? You know, we didn't, even if we talked about the history, we were still like, let's do this. You know, everybody was really on board, probably 100% amongst the students, let's do this.
Well, you know, the split had happened in 1971, you know, originally the United Federation.
Federation, right.
Federation of Music Therapists, and that was, you know, so it'd been over 20 years that.
And there were, and I don't want to keep talking if people want to ask questions, but there were lots of important things that happened along the way that started the path back to integration and unification, including, you know, the first NCATA conference in New York City. That was the first time, that was in '85, so that was just about 14 years after AAMT began, and that was the first time that you had the leaders and the members formally at a gathering together. And then a couple of years later, MAR, in a leadership role, had a joint conference with AAMT in Cherry Hill in '89, and then the '90 NCATA conference. So there were opportunities for the members to start interacting in the conference side that were, I think, were important. Respectively, both models were producing music therapists that were passing the board certification exam, and so it occurred to me that as we were looking at that particular piece, that if we were to try to reconcile the models ahead of the decision to unify, that could easily be a negotiating pitfall that could prevent unification. That somebody who did not want a particular piece of one model or the other might try, push back against that, and that could thwart the whole initiative. And so what we said was, we're not going to deal with that topic unless we decide to unify. And if we make the decision to unify, then we'll appoint a commission of people from both former associations to work on the issue of educational and clinical training. You had two models that were working, accredited, approved, and producing MTBCs. There was no real reason to have to solve that problem ahead of time. And so that's how we proceeded. There were a few people that didn't like that really wanted to see that piece resolved, but we knew that could be a deal breaker, and we strategically did not do it that way. We moved forward the proposal to unify with a provision that there would be the commission, and the commission was then formed and worked really hard and did great work post-unification.
And how was like CBMT's role in this?
CBMT's role was basically to become the single credentialing body. One of the things that initially I was most disappointed with in the initial results is that I had thought that if we're making the decision to unify and dealing with this credentialing soup, alphabet soup craziness, as we talked about a minute ago, that we could act in a way that would solve that and completely wipe the slate clean. We were not able to do that entirely at the time because although everybody who was an RMT or CMT was grandfathered in the initial MTBC period, enough time had gone by from 85 until 94 that there were some people who had chosen to not maintain their MTBC and rather retain their RMT or CMT or ACMT and had let their MTBC lapse. Had not chosen not to renew it or do the continuing ed. And unfortunately, in terms of the guidelines that CBMT operates under for its own accreditation, there was no way to go back and undo that. We could not do a second grandfathering, and we tried and looked at a number of permutations and combinations of how we might do that so that we could literally wipe the slate clean and start over again with MTBC, and we simply could not do that no matter what alternative we came up with. It was not possible. So in the end, what we agreed to do was that, first of all, the three organizations, AAMT and NAMT and CBMT, agreed that it would no longer be acceptable to combine the credentials like we had said it would be initially. So you couldn't be RMTBC anymore. Okay, you could not use that in that fashion. And if you held both, you needed to make a choice of which you were going to use. And then for the folks that wanted to retain RMT, CMT, or ACMT and use that as opposed to MTBC, we created the National Registry, which still exists to this day, but not for long. By design, I remember the phone call to this day where we talked about how to deal with that, and the date that we settled on was 2020, which is 2 years from now, and by the agreement of the unification proposal, the registry goes away in 2020. So there is still one piece left to finish unification, and it's that piece that happens 2 years from now. But that's sort of the backstory behind that. The intent was to try to deal with it carte blanche, but we were not able to do that at the time.
I'll just share that I was RMTBC, and on New Year's Eve of the year that you had to make the decision, a lot of RMTBC people I know had a fire in their fireplace and put an R on a piece of paper, and at midnight burned their arm. It was like, we're
Y'all
all
got
in.
in some freaky
We're
rituals.
all in with MTBC. We embraced it fully.
I thought you were supposed to with ex-boyfriends in there.
That's another session.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
It's probably a stronger relationship than the ex-boyfriend.
And that's a testament to the will of the members to move forward, because that's no little thing to set aside, your credential that you first had as a music therapist, whether it was registry, RMT, or CMT, or whatever it was. That's a big deal, right? And so to come to a place where the association is saying you're going to have to make a choice, your choice, but you have to make it. That's not a little thing, and it was like what I was concerned about, the name change. I mean, NAMT was much bigger than AAMT. And I was really concerned that was the biggest thing, actually, that I had the most anxiety about in terms of proposing it, was to propose a name change. In the end, the name didn't end up not being that big of a deal, but I thought it might be. So it was, but that's an interesting story about the art for those folks.
Bryan, what, if anything, do you think was lost in unification?
What do I think was lost?
Did you hear the question, Gary?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't have an answer for that off the top of my head. Gary, do you have an answer for that? I don't have an answer, Tony.
Well, I don't know what's lost. It's just different. Before unification, we were close-knit in the AAMT, but it's like a close-knit small group of people that you tend to have a lot of connection with, as a community and working together. It still continues on, but in a different sense. We're no longer, maybe not as part of the overall music therapy organization, but more like a personal friend. But I don't know what would be exactly lost in what I could think of per se.
I know they talk about the journal a lot was lost, music therapy.
And the journal, I mean, by agreement of the proposal, what we were going to do with publications was also put into the hands of a task force post-unification that was made up of representatives to discontinue music therapy, but there were, I think, some attempts made to really take some of the things that had been significant in AAMT publications and work them in, particularly in MTP issues and other contexts. But I would suspect, Tony, to answer your question, that, and again, if former AAMT members correct me if I'm wrong, I think from a personal standpoint, it probably felt much different as far as change goes for the former AAMT members, because they were much like a region that we would have conceived of in NAMT in terms of proximity and conference and so on and so forth. I think for many NAMT members, except for the name change and dealing with the credential when it came along, there wasn't much to change your day-to-day existence as a music therapist. So I think it was more so for, I guess it's more so for AAMT members.
And it felt like that. It felt like a change in consciousness and people there were fears that wait a minute, if we unify, are we going to get, is our way of working going to be limited? Our practice is going to be limited, and so there were a lot of fears in that way. But then, of course, there were people from both organizations that were doing similar work, so there was that happening too. But there were fears about that. I would always tell people, no, let's think of it like this: we have more of an opportunity to influence them. I have another thing that I felt was a loss, and I don't know about how this was decided to. Where this went. So what happened is that to get your certification in AAMT, you had to complete a form that had all the competencies listed out, and you had to self-rate yourself on each competency. And along with that, you had to put in your grade that you got in the course that was related to that competency. So you would go through your coursework and say, all right, this course taught me about these competencies. And then you put them down, and then you rate how competent you feel you are, and then you put the grade you got in that course. And you put the whole thing down and lay it all out, and it took a while. I mean, it took days to complete this, and this was one of the ways, you had to do this to get the certification. And then what happened also is that the internship supervisor and the academic supervisor filled out same form for you, and they rated you as well. And what this was used for was school review, which I thought was a brilliant idea. And so when school review came around, you compare the three forms and you say, well, you look for the discrepancies, and then you can go and talk to the academic, the academic supervisor and say, why is there this discrepancy? Why is this new professional saying that they didn't get the competence that they were supposed to be getting? So I was wondering, was that just let go of because, was that just considered to be part of yielding to CVMT, or was that discussed?
It was let go because AAMT was not doing credentialing anymore, nor was NAMT.
Well, but I think that I thought the real value of that was not in, well, partly to get to credentialing, but the other value of it was real, and maybe even, well, I don't know, not more important, but equally important was its assistance in school review.
In program
process.
review.
Program
Okay.
review.
Program review.
Yeah.
But again, my understanding of it, and I was probably a little bit earlier than Gary, was that AAMT, we were based on competency-based, and NAMT was not. And it was a number of years, as you say, the two different education models were both absorbed within the AMTA. And so we were trained at AAMT with the competency-based criteria rather than the content that had been delineated by NAMT, and that was one of the biggest sticking points, I think. And as you say, the decision was made to unify and work that out later. And when did AMTA absorb the competency-based education? What year was that?
When did NAMT do that?
With AMTA, when everybody.
Well, I think that NAMT had actually started adopting the competencies before unification.
Yeah.
I just don't remember I just don't know the years.
Yeah.
Because actually that
Curious to know
started
the years.
before.
Yeah, and as I remember it, that was a huge sticking point. And I was at NYU in '78, and that was one of the things I kept hearing. Well, we based our education on the competencies that you need rather than the course content that had been approved by NAMT. But That's the way I remember it. Gary, do you remember it that way?
Yeah, you give back me flashbacks, huh?
Sorry,
Because I
hi
was
Gary, it's Beth
clarification.
Schwartz, haven't seen you in a long time, how are you?
And we used to actually interview graduates sometimes. It seemed kind of discrepancy between the internship and the school, yeah, actually in those days. But if I recall, one of the things was the agreement was dealing with competency-based training. That was one of the gold standards, supposedly, of the programs going towards a competency-based training. And that's the direction we're supposed to be worked out with the CBMT as well. But I know the CBMT still has that like standardized testing criteria. But the school programs, internship is heading towards the competency-based training. And even by then, the MAT kind of adopted the competency-based framework. And that's I think that's one of the reasons why we kind of worked in the unification like that rather than to be worked out with the new organization.
Yeah, NAMT was moving that direction.
Moving that direction
Right.
anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's just my remembrance, is
Right.
that this was,
Yeah, I just don't
was
remember the
talked about
years.
as being a huge sticking point.
Yeah.
I have a question on when I think, I'm glad this is coming up now and that this Fireside chat is happening in light of the MLE and the next big decision
Right.
that we have to face.
Nice
So
segue.
So when I frame it into the next big thing we have on our plates, can you share with me your experiences, both your personal experience working with Ken and with each other in the association, but also the members, and how you opened up to new ideas and how you shifted positions over time, and what we can learn from that as we get into the debate more, as we move forward.
Well, there were some things we did that I think, in retrospect, we did correctly and strategically, smartly, I hope. One was the amount of time we allowed for the discussion of the proposal, and we said that from the outset. It's going to be a minimum of a year discussion, and we've done something similar with MLE. So it was not a rush decision. There were, in terms of NAMT, there were the town hall meetings at both national conferences when I was president. Then there were the 8 town hall meetings in the regions, and an opportunity for people to ask questions of all three, all three associations. We were all represented there in those meetings. So the opportunity to hear members, I think, was critical. The decision to not make an agreement on educational clinical training contingent, to not make unification contingent on solving any problems with educational clinical training or publications for that matter. I think that was critical because I think it could have gotten derailed if we had done it another way. And then the decision to give up credentialing and clear up the mess that we had created as a profession. And we had, writ large, I'm talking about all 3 associations, we had created a mess. 7 credentials for a profession the size of music therapy. What a nightmare.
So being willing to recognize where some of the failings are and let them go so that something new can emerge.
Right. And I don't want to run ahead to tomorrow, but in the MLE report, I hope people, if you've looked at the report and seen it, I hope you're paying close attention to what is in the CBMT summary data, because there's some really disconcerting data there with regard to educational clinical training these days. So I think there's lessons to be learned, but there is a difference, and that is, as big a change as unification was, it was all in our house. It was all in the music therapy house. It didn't really affect people outside of music therapy per se. Not in a regulatory way. It was just all about us. MLE is not all about us. It affects schools, it affects programs, it affects interns. It's just a bigger question. And it's that much bigger in terms of its importance, but it's also, it also has bigger ripple effects in terms of looking at it, without question.
Bryan, can you speak to when it was decided about the competencies and the education, that the things that you had to let go? Were there things on any of your personal lists that you were like, you wish wasn't let go?
No, not for me personally. The only thing that I had to grapple with, the strongest thing I had to grapple with at a personal level was not being able to completely change the credentialing situation to having just the MTBC right then. I was dogged to try to make that happen. And we explored every possible, permutation of that with CVMT, and ended up having to do the route that we did. That was hard for me to let go. But it's when I learned the lesson about, discerning what you can have an influence on and going after that, and then discerning what you can't have an influence on and being willing to accept that. And that was a place where I had to come to that decision.
But you had said there were certain things you had to avoid, that you said, oh, this would like blow unification out of the water. So what were those things that were like, oh, we have to avoid this and put that on the back burner for future state because that will fizzle our attempts for unification? I'm really curious about what was put on the back burner, because otherwise it would distract from the goal of unification. I'm curious if there were topics that you remember.
Inquire.
Yeah.
No, I'm sorry, I guess I'm not remembering exactly what I said. The decision was about the educational, the big pieces that we had decided up front that had to be dealt with in order to have any chance of putting the two associations together was the issue of the differences in educational and clinical training, differences in publication, the credentialing and reciprocity issue between AAMT and NAMT with regard to the RMT, CMT, and how each association looked at those. Those were the big items that we had to deal with, and so we took them individually and talked through them. And the reciprocity credentialing issue was dealt with by the agreement to give it up to CBMT. Okay, give up credentialing to CBMT, period, and get out of the business. The education and clinical training piece was, the decision was to postpone that. If we decided to unify, then we would create, and we actually had the proposal for what the commission would look like in terms of its makeup. And the same thing with publications, that we would have a publications task force, if we decided to unify, that would look at that topic. So we tried to take the major topics that were that we thought were the most important to the members and to the leaders of the association, of both associations, and deal with those, up front in the proposal. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, all right.
And Bryan, to tie to that, since this is for posterity, the Joint Commission. So how did you choose, maybe you should want to articulate the members, since some of them are no longer here, of the Joint Commission, and how did you choose those members? Because they're the ones, again, I just have to say is, you can't discount the leadership of you and Ken Egan in making this happen. And when you say, how did it happen because there was really strong leadership. But then you moved to the Joint Commission to work out all the details, but how did you decide who was going to be on the Joint Commission, and how did that process happen?
I don't have very specific answers to give you, Beth, on that. Each group decided, we agreed, I think there were 5 members from each, and I think each association decided how they were going to do it. I honestly don't remember. I think it might have been the assembly that decided who the 5 members were going to be. I honestly don't know.
Garrett, do you remember?
I think it's people who were invested in involvement at the time. They wanted to work on these areas. That's what I remember. It wasn't like a large group voting type of situation, but I think it was just like people who very interested in these areas that they wanted to get involved, and that's why we allowed them to do that.
Each association picked, but I just don't remember. Remember exactly how they got picked. In the case of NAMT, it might have been the president who looked for names and brought them to the board. Perhaps we would have to go back and look. I know we have the names of who those people were. I can't tell them to you off the top of my head. I know that Ken Bruce had chaired it, and that was a decision of the commission. They selected him to chair it. And I also know that they decided up front in their process that whatever outcomes they came to as a commission, they made their own in-house rule that they had to be unanimous, they had to be unanimous. And that they found to be very difficult to implement, but they did it in the end.
Yeah, one of the things that surprised me the most are the decision saying, before we move to the next step, we have to have, everybody agree at this level. And that I see being really difficult in this, especially when the MLE report was also split.
Yeah, and again, it's important to remember that they were a group of 10 people. They decided to impose that on themselves. Nobody imposed that on them. And I will tell you from a Roberts Rules standpoint that that's not necessarily even considered a good idea. That can thwart change by requiring unanimous consensus. They chose to do it. Nobody imposed it on them. They chose to do it, and they made it work.
Out of a spirit of
Out of a spirit of unification.
Truly unified.
Right.
Congress could take a lesson from that. Did the Assembly give any input then, of delegates? I don't know if that was with AAMT also.
On to what?
Unification, like when you presented the.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, we had discussions in the Assembly both years, and in the end, the Assembly I asked the Assembly, in the second meeting in Houston, there was discussion, there was a suggestion for a little bit of revision with regard to the timeline of the commission. And initially, we said the commission would start after unification. We realized that we didn't have to wait, because there was a 2-year implementation. By the time we took the vote in 96 to 98 was 2 years to give each association time to conduct its business and close its business out, respectively. And we realized that we didn't have to wait for 2 years for the commission to start. Once we decided to unify, and so we made that change in the proposal. And then I asked the Assembly to do something which is rarely done in parliamentary context, and I asked the Assembly to not just to approve it, to send on to the membership, but to adopt it. And when you ask a group in the parliamentary context to adopt something that they're voting on, it means that they are consenting as if they had written it themselves. And I did that purposely in terms of what this was about, in terms of unifying, because I really felt like if the Assembly set the lead into NAMT, that I was pretty sure the membership would follow. And they did. It was not 100% vote in the Assembly. I don't remember the percentage, but it was overwhelmingly passed in the Assembly. And then what was sent to the members, the NAMT members, was the bylaw changes that actually the membership voted that implemented the unification.
We have just a few minutes to wrap up. Are there any other questions for Bryan and Gary?
I'll tell you a funny story about Joe Ross. If no one else has a question, okay? I'll tell you a funny story. He was the first AAMT president, right? He was one of the main leaders who got AAMT started at NYU. I know he was at one point a dean. I don't know if he was dean at the time that AAMT started, but he was an influential person and really critical in the establishment of AAMT. After the unification proposal was out and being discussed, and looks like we were moving forward with it, I was down at NYU and I was visiting Clive. And he said, "Have you ever met Joe Ross?" And I said, "No, I haven't." He said, "Well, come on, let's see if he's in." So we went upstairs to his office. And now Clive was a little bit of a devil, those of you that know him, right? And he sort of set up this introduction really quite craftily. And, he sort of, he set up just to introduce me as the president, and just as I was shaking Joe Ross's hand, okay? And he knew exactly what he was doing. And so we sat and had a good visit. And then Joe Ross started into a little bit of a whining session in terms of what it was like to get AAMT started. He said, we always met on the weekends. We were meeting on Saturdays. And the meetings was on and on and on. It was so hard to have to get a second association started. And so I let him go on for a while. And then I said, "Well, Joe, you know what? If you think it was hard to start a second association, you ought to try putting two of them back together again." And he just laughed. It was fun to see him. And that's the only time I ever saw him.
is there anything we can do now? I mean, when I first came to MAR, I mean, I saw the, Clive and the contingency there. Is there any thing that we can do now to keep the kind of connection going with New York, and music therapists, coming to conferences?
You mean,
Put together? Are we kind of unified, or does it feel like that?
well,
still?
I looked, Gary, why don't you answer that question?
Okay. Let's see. Well, to be honest, I like it the way it's going, the progress of the field. I guess to make it more accessible to people, it would be nice to have more local type of events so people can have more access at some level, or even web conferences based on technology to have more connection with other people. But that's what I have to see for the future. But basically, from the unification, the field definitely benefit, in my opinion. And I see how the range of people looking at how to practice music therapy grown tremendously. Yeah, that's how I see it. And as far as the school programs, lots of flexibility, that's very important. And I think it remains. I guess there is a big challenge as far as deciding about graduate level only training. That's coming up. So I know it's a big change, but I think again that's a big issue to grapple with. That we didn't end up doing with that with unification. So, but I think it's to deal with all this stuff that's going on in healthcare these days is unbelievable. All the changes that I think we have to evolve as well, and continue to connect with each other.
And what I saw is, an AAMT person, as an NAMT person over the years, where, when I look at conference programs, since that time, and I see presenters, from both associations, I see panels. Ronna Kaplan a few years ago did conference panels that were specifically designed to show, breadth and depth across music therapy approaches. That would have been unheard of before unification. So, when I see the ability of NAMT schools to use university-affiliated internships, which is something that came out of the commission, those are just practical, really great pieces that have been useful to me, in the context of being at Nazareth College. So, those are some sort of, specific things that come to my mind. And the fact that we're doing 20 years is just literally mind-blowing. So, the 4 years it seemed to go from, the discussions, in Vancouver at the CMT meeting to the Philadelphia meeting in '94. It was 4 years before we actually affected the actual date of AMT. That seemed like an eternity to me at the time, and now we're 20 years later celebrating. It's just incredible.
Yeah. Well, it was an incredible time. I certainly remember, I'm sure you do, Bryan, how much work we had to put into it.
Yeah, I mean, we worked hard, but we weren't doing it by ourselves. We were doing it with two boards that respectively were completely supportive from the get-go about sending the proposal out, having it discussed, moving music therapy forward, moving the ball forward. And the boards then helped lead that discussion back to the regions. And then in the end of the day, I think the members were ready to move forward, particularly East Coast folks that couldn't figure out why they needed to belong to two associations and pay double dues and all that sort of thing, to the folks that were in Toronto and saw what music therapy together really looked like, at that conference. So those are all pieces of the puzzle that fell together. But there were a lot of people that were supporting it, a lot of leaders in both associations that were supporting Ken and I. It wouldn't have happened just if it had just been the two of us. There were a lot of people pushing it forward.
We're glad it did. It's been 20 years of unification, and thanks Bryan and Gary for, kind of looking back at it and sharing the backstory behind it. And thanks, Terry, for holding your arm up for this entire. Gary,
thank
next
you.
time I
Yes.
want to have you on the screen, maybe be like the Wizard of Oz. But thanks, Gary, and thanks, Brian.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.